Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show you all the techniques I use for blending graphite pencils. It's really important to spend a bit of time learning about blending. The techniques aren't always that difficult, but they can make a big difference in your drawing. So I highly recommend taking a few minutes to learn about some of these techniques, especially if they're new to you, or perhaps you want to brush up your skills. The first method I'm going to talk about today is blending stumps. They are just kind of compressed paper formed into a smooth tip. The big ones are more for large areas of shading, for example, areas of skin tone. The smaller ones are for the finer details. I'll show you some real examples of drawings I've done using these methods. I'll leave links to those drawing videos in the description below. Blending stumps often come with these small pads of sandpaper. The idea is to sand off the used tip before you use it. This creates a clean surface that won't smudge from all the graphite that is already built up on it. For this type of drawing, it's best to use a really smooth paper. This is Bristol board paper, really nice for getting a smooth drawing texture. I'm drawing 3 spherical shapes here to show the blending stumps in use. I'm using 4B pencil for the big circle, 2B for the medium, and HB for the small circle. You can see the results with the different grades of pencil. It's quite subtle, but there's a small difference. Okay, I've shaded these pretty smoothly with just pencil. No blending so far. Now I'm grabbing the large blending stump and I'm going to use gentle circular motion on the large 4B circle. Starting at the lightest area in the middle, the highlight. You can also start in the darkest area. It's worth experimenting to see what you prefer. I'm using some light strokes in a gentle sweeping motion to start, and I'm gradually incorporating some circular motion in the darker areas, then gradually blending light and dark in an even way. Having a good technique in blending can really take your drawing to the next level. It's not necessarily that hard either. It's just about choosing the right method for whatever you're drawing. Try not to go over the edge if you want to keep a crisp line at the end of the shape. As is often the case, it's best not to be too rigid in terms of doing this in stages. Take an organic, fluid approach. Use your eye and trust your judgment. The main point of this blending is to remove the grainy texture of the pencil shading to create a smoother texture. This is great for things like realistic drawing, things like skin tone. It's a subtle difference, but it's effective. I'm also using a more shallow angle so that the larger flat plane of the blending stump is touching the paper. The larger surface area keeps it smoother rather than just using the fine tip. When I get to the lighter areas, I'm actually using the other end of the blending stump as it's clean and won't transfer the dark graphite from the darker areas I've just blended. One thing I'm not doing is rubbing the blending stump back and forward. This creates a bumpy texture. What's happening here is the stump is absorbing some of the graphite, and then it's actually moving it around the paper as you blend. It's one of the stronger methods of blending. You get quite a strong result. One of the useful things about a blending stump is that you can also use it as a kind of pencil. Once it has some graphite absorbed on the tip, you can use it to create soft, smooth shading without using a pencil. This is a really nice technique. One way to help with this is to draw some pencil strokes on a blank piece of paper, then rub the stump on it. Then use that on your drawing. I use this method fairly often, for example in areas like around the eyes in portrait drawing. Okay, now I'm blending the 2B sphere or circle. I'm using a slightly smaller blending stump and I've cleaned the tips off with sandpaper. One way to go even smoother can be to blend like this. Then do one more layer of pencil shading and blending again on top. And even doing that a third time. I sometimes do this if I want a really realistic, smooth effect. Here's the shade I get when I use the stump with 2B graphite on it. It's subtle but still quite visible. One of the effects of blending like this is that the overall shade of graphite tends to lighten a bit as the darker areas are merged into the lighter areas. And here's the shade with using the absorbed graphite directly on the paper. Very light, but useful for the lightest areas of shading. The second method I'm going to look at today is the cotton bud. The cotton bud is very similar to the paper blending stump and can be used in a similar way. I think the cotton bud is less good for very small areas and edges, as it doesn't have a fine tip like the blending stump. You also have to hold it with your fingers, whereas the larger blending stumps you hold with your hand, like a pencil, which can be a bit more comfortable. But it comes down to personal preference. The end result is still good, and I use this method occasionally, although I use blending stumps more. You can also do the same thing in terms of using the cotton bud with some absorbed graphite on it to shade directly onto the paper, just like with the blending stump. By the way, I prefer using cotton buds with paper stems, if possible, so no plastic. The next method I'm going to look at today is tissue paper. For this example, I'm using an HB mechanical pencil, which I often use for more sketchy type drawings, especially portraits. Tissue paper is a useful blending method mainly for larger areas. It's a subtle type of shading, and good for achieving a really smooth, consistent texture across a large surface. I use this for areas of skin tone in portrait drawing, for example. In these large areas, this is better than using a blending stump. I recommend using the smoothest and softest tissue you can though. Using textured rough paper like kitchen paper won't achieve as smooth a texture. In the first two circles here, I'm using a crosshatch shading technique, which is just lines in one or more directions. Sometimes with crosshatch shading, I use tissue paper to blend slightly. You can see the effect here. It's a nice subtle texture, smooth and consistent, and great for large areas. This first circle has the type of shading I might use on the edge of a jawline, for example. This style usually retains some of the shading lines. It's a slightly more rustic look. This second circle has the type of shading I might use under a cheekbone, for example, with some of the shading lines still visible. In the third circle, I haven't done any pencil shading at all. I'm just using a tissue paper straight on the bare paper. The tissue already has some graphite absorbed on it from earlier shading. As you can see, this is a really nice method for creating subtle shadow. You might use this on the edge of the forehead, as an example. This also works with all other grades of pencil. I've had the occasional question about whether you can use fingers to blend. It works to a degree, and it can create some nice effects, but it can also be a bit messy, and it tends to leave marks on the paper. This is from the oils on the skin, which can spoil the drawing, so I avoid this method completely. Okay, the fourth method I'm going to talk about today is the dry paintbrush. I use this technique a lot. The first method is to brush directly over areas you've already shaded with pencil. This blends the transitions and smooths everything nicely. It's also great if you want the shading to gradually fade into nothing at the edge of an area, like the shadows above the eyes. So this is just a regular paintbrush, completely dry. This filbert style brush has a rounded tip and it's quite a large one. I find it really useful for large areas of blending. It's usually more subtle than tissue paper. It's easier to create a really smooth, gradual texture, which you have a lot of control over. You can often brush it on the paper for quite a long time before you start to see any major effect. One of the good things about this method is that you can retain texture and still blend it together. For example, if you've drawn skin tones and you have skin texture and you want to keep it without smudging it completely, this is a good way, as it will blend things together in a subtle way, but still keeping some of the details. I often use this method for areas around the eye, for example. The second method is to brush straight on the paper without shading with pencil first. To do this, you can draw some pencil lines on another sheet of paper, then brush over this to absorb some graphite. Then brush this directly onto your drawing. This is a really useful way of creating subtle shading over a large area. If you found the video helpful, feel free to leave a like and hit the subscribe button for more videos like this. Okay, over to you. I'd love to know which blending method you prefer to use. Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching and see you next time.